The wind howled relentlessly between towering skyscrapers, its icy fingers weaving through crowded streets and cutting through the thin layers of fabric that shielded those huddled beneath tired awnings. In a forgotten corner of a bustling subway station, amid the echo of distant footsteps and the hum of passing trains, sat an old man. His unkempt hair and weathered beard told stories of decades spent under harsh elements. His clothes, threadbare and stained, were a testament to years of neglect. Clutched tightly in his gnarled hands was a crumpled piece of paper. More than just refuse discarded by time, it was a letter that carried the heavy burden of a life once full of promise and valor. The faded ink on the paper was nearly illegible in the dim light, yet every word seemed to pulse with life. "Dear Mr. Donald Trump," it began, the shaky handwriting betraying both physical frailty and a deep, unyielding emotion. Its writer was John Miller, a homeless veteran of the Vietnam War whose sacrifices had been forgotten by a nation that once hailed him a hero. Now, as he sat shivering against the cold concrete, John's letter was not a plea for charity, nor a desperate cry for attention. It was a solemn question, a demand for recognition that echoed with the sorrow of countless forgotten souls. Does America still remember us? John Miller was not always the man who now waited alone in the chill of a subway station. In his youth, he had been a proud soldier, a fierce warrior who had stood shoulder to shoulder with his comrades in the dense, humid jungles of Vietnam. In those days, his uniform was crisp and his eyes shone with determination. Every morning he awoke with a burning desire to protect his country, knowing full well the perils that lurked in every shadow. For 8 years, John had fought amid the roar of artillery and the cries of battle, sacrificing personal comfort for duty and honor. He had witnessed horrors no one should have to see: the loss of close friends, the visceral terror of ambushes, and the grim reality that every mission might be his last. He had lost his closest brother in arms during one fateful firefight, a loss that etched a permanent scar into his soul. Back then, when he and his fellow soldiers returned home, they had been celebrated. Parades, medals, and proud embraces had filled those first days of freedom. But as time wore on, the accolades faded and the memories began to blur. Returning home did not bring the peace he had imagined. Instead, John found himself grappling with the invisible wounds of war. The vibrant echoes of camaraderie gave way to long, lonely nights. His hands, once steady and sure on the battlefield, now trembled under the weight of lingering trauma. The promises of a bright future for veterans became hollow, and slowly, John was left to drift into the margins of a society that no longer had space for its forgotten heroes. He tried to rebuild his life. John scoured job listings, attended veteran support centers, and even attempted to reconnect with family. Yet every door he knocked on seemed to close in his face. The society that had once honored his bravery now turned its back, regarding him as nothing more than an inconvenient reminder of battles fought and sacrifices made. Slowly, as the years passed, the robust, determined soldier was replaced by a frail, haunted figure, one whose only constant companion was the relentless ache of abandonment. As the years advanced, John Miller's life took a darker turn. A minor stroke, a cruel twist of fate, left him weakened and vulnerable. Though the hospital offered him a brief respite, a few days of sterile comfort and clinical care, once discharged, he found himself with no savings, no family to support him, and no place to call home. His few meager dollars evaporated in the struggle for survival, and the man who had once carried the weight of duty with pride now wandered the streets of New York City like a ghost. Homelessness was a slow, grinding descent into despair. Every night was a battle against the cold, every day a fight for scraps of food. John slept on hard, unforgiving pavement or in dark, damp doorways. his dreams haunted by the ceaseless noise of a past he could neither escape nor forget. The city, once a beacon of opportunity, now appeared as a vast, indifferent machine, swallowing him whole without a second thought. In his wanderings, John encountered others like him, veterans whose sacrifices had been rendered invisible by society's apathy. They would gather in dimly lit alleys or huddle in doorways, sharing quiet stories of valor and loss, their faces etched with the pain of lives left incomplete. Among these lost souls, John's own loneliness deepened. Every memory of the battlefield was now tinged with regret and bitterness, a painful reminder of a time when he had mattered, when his actions had meant something. Yet, in the depths of this crushing isolation, a single thought burned steadily within him: the desperate need to be remembered. John clung to the belief that, if only someone would hear his story, the sacrifices of an entire generation might finally be acknowledged. And so, with trembling hands and a weary heart, he began to write. Sitting in the dim light of the subway station, John produced a letter that was more than paper and ink. It was the distillation of years of heartbreak, longing, and unspoken truths. With each shaky stroke of his pen, he poured out the remnants of his soul. The letter began simply, "Dear Mr. Donald Trump." There, the letter laid bare all the anguish and desolation of a man who had once stood for something noble. John described the battles he had fought, the comrades he had lost, and the promises that had been broken upon his return to civilian life. He wrote about the cold, lonely nights spent huddled in doorways, the hunger that gnawed at his insides, and the betrayal of a nation that had cheered for his triumphs on the battlefield, only to abandon him in his hour of need. He recalled the glimmer of pride he had once felt upon receiving his Medal of Honor, a small, gleaming symbol of his courage and sacrifice. That medal, however, had been stolen from him by a man named Frank Dawson, a slick operator whose smooth words had promised salvation but delivered only deceit. With that one precious token taken away, John felt as if the final remnant of his identity had been erased, leaving him with nothing but shattered memories. Yet even amid the overwhelming despair, the letter carried a single, resolute question. Does America still remember us? It was a plea not for pity or handouts, but for recognition, a demand that those who had given everything should not be consigned to oblivion. Finishing the letter, John sealed it with a trembling hand and slipped it into a battered envelope. In that moment, the simple act of writing became an act of defiance against a society that had so callously forgotten him. No one can say what happened immediately after John's letter was mailed. For a long while, it was just another piece of correspondence in the chaos of everyday life. Yet fate, it seemed, had plans for John Miller that stretched far beyond his wildest dreams. A few days later, while wandering near a busy intersection, John was approached by a well-dressed man whose expensive suit and polished watch set him apart from the crowd of street dwellers. The man's smile was rehearsed, his tone smooth and persuasive, a voice that promised hope in the midst of despair. "John Miller, am I right?" he asked, as if he had been waiting for John all along. John, whose life had taught him to be cautious, hesitated before nodding. The man introduced himself as Frank Dawson, the director of the American Veterans Support Fund, a name that shimmered with the promise of aid and dignity. Dawson explained that his organization was dedicated to helping veterans like John, those who had sacrificed so much but received so little in return. He spoke of temporary housing, nutritious meals, and financial support that could finally provide a semblance of stability. For a moment, John's heart fluttered with hope. Could this be the answer to his endless nights of wandering, the cure to his isolation and hunger? Yet, A cautious part of him whispered warnings. He had seen too many empty promises, too many con men who preyed on the desperate. "Tell me," John rasped, his voice edged with both yearning and skepticism, "what do you need from me?" With a smile that widened as if he already knew the answer, Dawson explained, "I've heard that you still possess your Medal of Honor, a symbol of your service and sacrifice. If you donate that medal to our charity auction, we can guarantee not only that you receive the help you need, but that the honor of veterans like you is brought back into the light." Words struck John with an almost unbearable force. That medal was more than medal and ribbon. It was the last vestige of his identity, the tangible proof that he had once been a hero. Yet, as much as it pained him to part with it, the thought of enduring another winter on the streets, hungry and alone, was too much to bear. In the cold calculus of survival, his pride was trumped by desperation. After hours of inner turmoil, John agreed. Under the cold glow of a street lamp outside a shabby office building, the supposed headquarters of the American Veterans Support Fund, he handed over his cherished medal. Dawson's smile seemed to light up the darkness, and with a few swift, practiced moves, the medal was tucked away in a drawer. Its fate now seemingly sealed, Dawson assured John that help was on the way and that soon he would be contacted with arrangements for housing and financial support. For a fleeting moment, John allowed himself to believe in a brighter future, but as the hours turned to days and no phone call came, the bitter reality began to seep back into his bones. Desperation forced him to return to the building, only to find it abandoned and the office shuttered. A small notice taped to the glass window read, "The American Veterans Support Fund has ceased operations due to financial difficulties. We apologize for the inconvenience." John stood frozen, a silent storm of anger and despair churning within him. He had been scammed. A con meticulously executed by a man in a tailored suit who had stolen not only his precious medal, but his last shred of dignity. The cold night air pressed against him as he sank onto a concrete step, feeling utterly invisible and betrayed. Even as John Miller sank deeper into the shadows of despair, the letter he had written remained in the world, a silent plea cast into the vast ocean of America's unhearing masses. Every day, thousands of letters reached the White House, messages from citizens with complaints, suggestions, or praises, letters from influential figures and everyday people alike. It was in this tumult of correspondence that John's letter, fragile and desperate in its handwritten form, eventually caught the eye of someone unexpected. Emily Carter was a young staffer working in the White House mailroom, a place where the voices of ordinary citizens often went unnoticed amid the clamor of political rhetoric. Yet, Emily had a habit of reading the letters before they were sorted, a quiet rebellion against the impersonal nature of bureaucracy. On one bright morning, as sunlight poured into her small office and chased away the gloom of early hours, she discovered John Miller's letter. The words leapt from the page, raw and heart-wrenching. Emily could feel the weight of every sentence, the tremor in the handwriting, and the sorrow of a man who had once been a proud soldier. The letter was more than a plea. It was a question, a demand for accountability. Does America still remember us? Emily's eyes filled with tears as she read of the battles fought, the lives lost, and the lonely nights spent wandering the city. In that moment, she knew she could not let this letter be lost among the countless others. Without hesitation, Emily grabbed the letter and ran through the corridors of the White House, her footsteps echoing with urgency. She made her way to the office of the president's senior advisor, her heart pounding with the belief that something must be done for a man whose voice had been silenced for far too long. It was in the quiet sanctum of a high-ranking office that the fate of John Miller began to shift. At that moment, Donald Trump was deep in meetings, discussing matters of national policy and the ever-pressing issues of the day, when an aide arrived with a simple directive. "Sir, you need to read this." Laying the letter before him, the aide stepped back and waited. Trump picked up the fragile envelope, his eyes scanning the rough handwriting and the earnest, desperate tone of the message. As he read each word, a rare stillness fell over him. In a room filled with the buzz of strategic conversations and the clatter of keyboards, nothing else mattered except the voice of a forgotten soldier, a man whose life had been reduced to shadows and cold pavement. When he finished reading, Trump set the letter down gently and exhaled deeply, as if releasing years of accumulated discontent. "John Miller," he murmured to himself, the name resonating with a mix of regret and resolve. "Find this man." Then, with a look that brooked no delay, he issued an order that would set in motion events no one could have predicted. Find him, or at least find the truth. Within moments, a special task force was assembled. Over the course of the next 48 hours, teams scoured homeless shelters, veteran centers, and city streets in search of any trace of John Miller. It was a race against time, for the man had no address, no bank records, no identifiable markers beyond his battered face and the lonely eyes of one who had seen too much sorrow. On the third day, local police reported a disturbing incident. An elderly homeless man had collapsed near a small diner in downtown New York. Emergency responders arrived swiftly, and when they reached the man, they found him barely clinging to life. Clutched in his trembling hand was a torn piece of newspaper, a silent relic of the world he once knew. As paramedics stabilized him and rushed him to a hospital, a sleek black limousine pulled up beside the ambulance. Inside, Donald Trump sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the unfolding scene. He had seen countless reports of veterans in distress, but never before had he witnessed the raw, unvarnished tragedy of a man like John Miller lying abandoned on a cold city street. In the ambulance, as sirens wailed and headlights cut through the darkness, Trump's voice, calm yet resolute, rang out. "Take him to the best hospital in the city. I want him treated like a general." His words were not mere rhetoric. They were a promise to a man who had been forgotten for far too long. At the hospital, bright lights and the sterile scent of antiseptic replaced the bitter cold of the streets. John Miller slowly opened his eyes, finding himself in a room that felt both alien and comforting. Nurses bustled about, checking vitals and ensuring that every need was met. A gentle smile from a kind-hearted nurse provided a small solace, whispering reassurances that he was safe, that he was finally cared for. John, still disoriented, could only murmur weakly, Who would want to see me?" as he tried to reconcile the stark contrast between the hospital's warmth and the relentless indifference of the outside world. Moments later, the door opened and in walked a man whose presence silenced the room. Donald Trump, no longer the distant figure of political spectacle, stood before him with eyes that bore the weight of responsibility and something far more personal, a deep, unyielding determination to right a great wrong. "Mr. Miller," Trump said, his voice steady and free of any political flourish, "I read your letter." John could barely summon the strength to reply, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and wonder. I don't know what to say," he managed. Trump settled into the chair beside John's bed. "I've seen too many veterans left behind," he said quietly. "I know they're men and women who fought, bled, and lost everything for this country, only to be abandoned when they came home. I never thought I'd have to see it with my own eyes. Not like this. Not like you." John's eyes filled with tears, each one a silent testimony to years of neglect and unhealed wounds. "How did it come to this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Trump's gaze hardened with quiet fury as he listened to John recount the years of battles fought on foreign soil, the deep scars of loss, the endless struggle against a system that had cast him aside. John spoke of the proud moments in uniform, of the brotherhood forged in the crucible of war, and then of the crushing despair that followed, a descent into homelessness, the betrayal of broken promises, and the ultimate theft of his Medal of Honor by a man named Frank Dawson. When John's story drew to a close, silence enveloped the room. Trump's hands clenched into tight fists, not out of pity, but in raw, seething anger. "Frank Dawson," he repeated, his voice a low growl. "I won't let a man like that walk free. Not while I'm here." John's voice, fragile and tentative, asked, "But why me? Why did you choose me?" Trump's eyes softened for a moment as he leaned forward, speaking with a sincerity that was rare in the corridors of power. "Because I care. Because you deserve to be remembered, and because I believe that the sacrifices you made, the battles you fought, should never be erased from our national story." Then, with a decisive motion, Trump reached for his phone and dialed a number with absolute authority. "I want a full investigation on Frank Dawson and his organization," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "If there's evidence of fraud, I want him prosecuted immediately." John stared in disbelief as the enormity of Trump's words sank in. In that quiet hospital room, far from the cold streets he had known, a promise was made. A promise of justice, dignity, and a future where he would no longer be forgotten. Before leaving the room, Trump added, "But first we'll take care of you. You're not going back to the streets. I'm arranging a permanent home for you, and I want you to be part of my new veteran support initiative." Overwhelmed, John could only whisper, "Why me?" "Because you deserve to be remembered," Trump replied, his voice firm yet compassionate. In the days that followed, John Miller's story spread like wildfire across America. News outlets seized upon the tale of a homeless Vietnam veteran rescued by the intervention of a president who had finally decided that enough was enough. Social media buzzed with hashtags like "Remember Our Veterans" and "John Miller," as citizens from every corner of the country voiced their shock and indignation at the plight of those who had once fought for their freedom. As more details emerged about John's life, his days of valor, his struggles on the streets, the painful theft of his Medal of Honor, the story ignited a national debate. How could a country that prided itself on freedom and sacrifice allow its veterans to be reduced to nothing more than invisible specters wandering its sidewalks? Public opinion shifted, and calls for comprehensive reform in veteran support programs grew louder by the day. Behind the scenes, the White House mobilized a series of meetings and task forces dedicated to overhauling the system that had so long failed veterans. Trump, energized by his personal encounter with John, declared that no veteran would be allowed to fade into obscurity while he was in office. A nationwide initiative was launched, promising better housing, improved health care, and greater opportunities for those who had once given everything for their country. Emily Carter, the young staffer who had first discovered John's letter, became a key voice in the movement. She testified before congressional committees, sharing her belief that every letter, every cry for help from the forgotten corners of America must be heard. Through interviews and public appearances, she and others called on citizens to demand accountability from the government. A call that resonated deeply with the nation's veteran community. Local organizations sprang into action, rallying support for veterans and organizing community events where stories like John's were shared openly. In small towns and big cities alike, once forgotten soldiers found their voices. For many, John Miller became a symbol of both suffering and hope, a reminder that a single letter written from the depths of despair could change the course of history. As the investigation into Frank Dawson and his fraudulent organization gained momentum, evidence began to mount. Journalists dug deep, uncovering a web of deceit that stretched far beyond John's personal tragedy. Dawson's slick promises and polished demeanor were revealed to be part of a larger scam that had ensnared numerous veterans, leaving behind a trail of broken dreams and stolen honor. Under intense media scrutiny and the firm orders of the president, law enforcement agencies worked tirelessly to trace the flow of funds, to track down every lead that could expose Dawson's network. In courtrooms and investigative offices across the nation, the truth emerged piece by piece. Testimonies from duped veterans, financial records that did not add up, and even recordings of conversations that betrayed Dawson's true intentions. The investigation became a cause célèbre, a fight not just for justice for John Miller, but for every veteran who had been scammed, every soldier who had been promised support only to be left in the lurch. As the case gained traction, public pressure forced government agencies to reform their oversight of veteran support programs, ensuring that no one else would suffer as John had. In the midst of this storm, John found himself thrust into the national spotlight. His name was broadcast on television, his story shared on newspapers and social media platforms. For the first time in decades, he was not just a nameless face in the crowd, but a hero who had been recognized and, more importantly, a man whose plight had spurred a call to action. In a symbolic gesture that captured the hearts of millions, a new ceremony was held in Washington, D.C. John Miller, now a living testament to resilience and sacrifice, was invited to a White House event dedicated to honoring the nation's forgotten veterans. Surrounded by fellow servicemen, dignitaries, and citizens who had gathered to celebrate a long overdue reckoning, John was presented with a replacement Medal of Honor. This new medal was not merely a trinket. It was a symbol of restored dignity, a tangible reminder that the sacrifices of veterans would never again be allowed to fade into obscurity. Standing on a stage illuminated by soft, golden light, John looked out at the sea of faces. Faces filled with gratitude, hope, and determination. In that moment, he no longer felt the crushing weight of abandonment. The hurt of his past was acknowledged, and the nation, for the first time in a long while, had chosen to remember. Donald Trump, whose decision to act had set off a chain of events that transformed countless lives, spoke passionately at the ceremony. Today, we honor not just one man, but every veteran who has fought for our country and has been forgotten by history. John Miller is a reminder that our duty to those who serve is eternal, and that every life deserves dignity and respect. We will ensure that no veteran is ever left behind. As the crowd erupted in applause, John's eyes welled with tears. Tears not only of sorrow, but of hope. In that moment, he understood that his life, once defined solely by loss and hardship, was now part of a larger narrative of redemption and change. In the months and years that followed, the initiative sparked by John Miller's story continued to reshape the landscape of veteran support in America. Comprehensive reforms were enacted, ensuring that veterans received the care, housing, and opportunities they had long been denied. Billions of dollars were allocated to programs designed to reintegrate veterans into society, to offer them the respect and resources that their sacrifices warranted. John, once a solitary figure on cold New York streets, became a respected advisor on veteran affairs. He spent his days speaking at community centers, mentoring younger veterans, and advocating for policies that recognized the contributions of those who had served. His story was taught in schools as an example of courage and resilience, a reminder that even the most forgotten souls could spark a movement for change. Every evening, as John sat on a park bench in his new neighborhood, one filled with lush greenery, friendly neighbors, and a warm community spirit, he would hold his replacement medal close. The once stolen symbol of his honor had been restored, not just physically, but in the hearts of a nation that now remembered. In that simple act of remembrance, John found peace. At the same time, Emily Carter continued her work in the White House, determined to ensure that every letter from a forgotten veteran was heard. She organized annual events dedicated to the stories of those who had fought for the country, making sure that the voices of the past would inform the policies of the future. Donald Trump's decision to personally intervene in John's case became a turning point for his administration, a moment when political rhetoric gave way to genuine compassion. His order to investigate Dawson's scam sent a powerful message that the nation would no longer tolerate the mistreatment of those who had given everything for their country. In the end, John Miller's simple question, "Does America still remember us?" resonated far beyond his own lonely existence. It sparked a national conversation about honor, sacrifice, and the responsibility of a society to care for its heroes. The movement that began with one trembling letter grew into a widespread campaign that forced change at the highest levels of government and within local communities across the nation. And so, as twilight fell on a nation reborn in its commitment to those who had once been forgotten, John Miller looked out over a new world, one in which every veteran's story was valued, every sacrifice remembered, and every life given the chance to flourish. The scars of war, though never fully healed, were now acknowledged as marks of bravery, and the cold streets that had once been his only home were replaced by communities that offered warmth, support, and hope. The journey of John Miller is a story of pain and resilience, of betrayal and redemption. It is a testament to the fact that even in the darkest corners of society, a single voice can ignite a movement. A movement that challenges indifference and forces us to confront the debts we owe to those who have defended our freedom. John's letter, written with trembling hands and a heavy heart, was not merely a cry for help. It was a demand that America live up to its promises, that the sacrifices of its veterans be honored with more than empty platitudes. For every veteran who sleeps on cold sidewalks, for every soldier whose sacrifice is reduced to a statistic, there is a lesson in John Miller's story that we must never forget. The true measure of a nation lies not in the grandeur of its monuments or the wealth of its elite, but in the dignity it affords those who have given everything in service of a greater cause. As you reflect on this tale, ask yourself, can a single letter change a life? Can one voice, raised in despair, spark a national awakening? In John Miller's journey from a homeless veteran to a symbol of hope and reform, the answer is a resounding yes. His story is a call to action. Every act of compassion, every effort to listen to the unheard, can change the course of history. If you have ever been touched by the sacrifices of our veterans, if you believe that no one should be left to fade into obscurity, then remember John Miller's question. Let it serve as a challenge to each of us to ensure that our country, our communities, and our hearts never forget those who have given their all. In the years to come, the legacy of John Miller will continue to inspire change. Programs will be expanded, voices will be heard, and policies will be reformed, all because one man dared to ask a simple, powerful question. As you go about your day, remember that every forgotten hero deserves recognition, every sacrifice deserves honor, and every voice, no matter how quiet, can echo through the corridors of power. For those who found meaning in John Miller's story, share it widely. Comment on how you believe society can better honor its veterans. Like, subscribe, and spread the word, because sometimes a single letter can indeed change the world. Thank you for listening, and may we all strive to ensure that the sacrifices of our heroes are never again lost to the shadows of indifference.